Okay, we're just gonna have to go with the spooky mood lighting, so there you go, I tried. Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I'm here with the first part of my February wrap-up. This includes all of the books I read for Cozy-thon and for Rereadathon, plus a couple extra. The first book I finished was actually one that I started at the end of January, and that is Dragon Slippers by Jessica Day George. This is the first book in a fantasy trilogy, and it basically starts out with our main character Creel being left for a dragon so that a prince can come and rescue her. And her family deliberately does this, and Creel decides that that's not really what she wants to happen. So she manages to bargain for her escape from the dragons and eventually ends up in her kingdom's capital city. Once there, she manages to find work at a dressmaker shop, and she soon finds herself making friends with unlikely people and getting embroiled in palace intrigue and politics. She also begins to notice that there may be something magical about her slippers that may save or destroy her kingdom. So I really enjoyed this book. It was just a lot of fun. It reminded me a little bit of the Enchanted Forest Chronicles from Patricia C. Reed. We really loved our main character Creel. She was so smart and determined and a little bit spunky, but not to the point of stupidity. And she really grew as a person throughout the book. She starts to make friends and get different perspectives on things that she thought she knew. And I also love the dragons in this book. I think that the culture of the dragons and like sort of the world building that Jessica Day George uses with those dragons was really interesting. I think that she did a lot of really creative things with them. You know, there are some elements that are definitely reminiscent of other fantasy books, but for the most part this felt like a pretty unique story, even though, like I said, the synopsis does feel kind of familiar. Creel's female friendships in particular were a highlight of the book for me, and there was also a really great through line in this book about first impressions and appearances and not judging people when you first encounter them. Altogether, I loved the plot, the characters, the world, the dragons, and I'm really excited about the next book. 4 stars and highly recommend. The first book that I actually picked up for Cozy-a-thon was The Ladies of Grace Adieu and Other Stories by Susanna Clarke. This was for the challenge that was to read a book with pink or red on the cover. And these are short stories that are set in the world of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and I loved this short story collection. I thought that the writing was really witty and clever and also really beautiful and spooky at times. It basically contained all of the things I loved about the full-length novel, while still giving us an expanded view of the world. I did have a couple of the stories that I enjoyed more than others, but I didn't rate any of them below 3.5 stars, which is very high for me in short story terms. Just a quick run through of the various ratings I gave to the stories in case you're interested. The Ladies of Grace Adieu was 4.5 stars. On Licorice Hill, 3.5 stars. Mrs. Mab, 4 stars. The Duke of Wellington Misplaces His Horse, 3.5 stars. Mr. Simonelli, or The Fairy Widower, was 5 stars. Tom Brightwind, or How the Fairy Bridge Was Built at Thorsby, was 4 stars. Antics and Frets, 4 stars. And John Usglass and the Cumbrian Charcoal Burner was 4.5 stars. So as you can tell, I really enjoyed the majority of these stories, and I highly recommend this collection. I think there's a couple stories that if you hadn't read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, you could sort of try this out to see if you would enjoy that 1,000-page book. And for those purposes, I would recommend The Ladies of Grace Adieu, or the story that is called Mr. Simonelli or The Fairy Widower. That's all one title. I also really enjoyed the feminist leaning that several of these stories had, especially because the original novel didn't have quite as many female characters as I liked, so this was a great supplement to that book, and I gave this story collection 4 stars. Next I finished Wires and Nerve Volume 2, Gone Rogue, which is by Marissa Meyer, art by Stephen Gilpin. This was not for any of the challenges, I just randomly decided I was in the mood to read this, so I did. And I really enjoyed this conclusion to the graphic novel. I definitely prefer it to the first volume. I feel like the art style of this one is better suited to my tastes, I guess, and I really liked the character development we got that was more of a focus in this book. I'm still not crazy about the overarching plot of the mutant wolves. I kind of feel like that's played out in the Lunar Chronicles universe, but I loved Eiko. Is it Eiko? I feel like I'm saying her name wrong. But I absolutely loved Eiko and just her kicking ass and being really smart and just coming to terms with her being an android and also still being a person, and I gave this volume 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I finished was P.S. I Still Love You by Jenny Han. This is the sequel to All the Boys I've Loved Before, and I read this for the challenge that was to read a book with a sweet or cute title. And I really enjoyed this book because sometimes I read contemporaries where it's clear that the author doesn't remember what it was like to be a teenager, if that makes sense. And through no fault of their own. I'm not saying those are bad books, but one of the things I love about Jenny Han is that she will write about problems or disasters that you have when you're in high school, and they don't feel like small problems. You know, like you're reading the book and you start remembering some of those things that happened in high school that seemed so big. I guess what I'm trying to say is that Jenny Han really respects the problems and struggles of her characters, regardless of how minor they may seem to other people. And that's one of the things I loved about this book. I still think that Lara Jean is a really believable main character. I know that a lot of people think she's too immature, and I can kind of see that sometimes, but overall she feels like a girl who's a little bit unusual and a little bit too optimistic, and she's just trying to do the best she can. I feel like this might be the only love triangle I've ever read that feels justified, because I can see why Lara Jean would get caught up in wanting two very different things and what these two very different guys represent to her. Don't know if any of that made sense. I gave this book 4 stars, even though there was a love triangle in it. Who am I? I don't know. Jenny Han, you wily enchantress. The next book I picked up was 1,000 Nights by E.K. Johnston, and this was also not for a particular challenge. And this is a retelling of the Scheherazade story, or Tales of 1001 Nights. And in this book, the king has come back from the desert changed. And after this change, he begins to take a bride every night, and she's usually dead by morning. They never last very long, and he has killed hundreds of girls at this point, when our main character decides to volunteer in order to save the life of her sister. And I was blown away by how much I loved this book. The characterizations in this book were fantastic, and that's pretty incredible considering that the majority of these characters are not actually given names in the story, but you still feel like you know them so well. I actually talked about this book in my book chat that was What Makes a Strong Female Character, which I will link down below in case you missed it, but as I mentioned in that video, I just adored the fact that female relationships and female friendships were such an intrinsic part of our main character's life, and her working together with other women and respecting the work of women was directly tied to what she wanted to accomplish and to the things that she wanted in this world. I also loved the writing style of this book and the plot and how everything tied together. I can see how the ending wouldn't be satisfying for everyone, but for some reason I was okay with it because of the unique way this story was told. And I also loved the way this book really addressed the power of stories and how important things that people do become distorted into legends, and I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 stars, and I'm really excited to check out more of E.K. Johnston's work. The next book I picked up was The Book of 1,000 Days by Shannon Hale, and this was for the challenge to read a fairy tale retelling and then watch the Disney adaptation of it. So I didn't actually end up doing the movie part because this is actually a retelling of the fairy tale known as Maid Maylene, I think. It's not a Rapunzel retelling, so I couldn't watch the Rapunzel movie. This is a story about a princess and her handmaiden who are locked in a tower because the princess refuses to marry the man her father wants her to, who's very cruel and horrible and just a monster, basically. So she doesn't want to marry him, and she and her handmaiden are locked up. It's told from the perspective of her handmaiden in a journal that she kind of writes to keep track of the days. And as the Goodreads synopsis tells you, they do eventually escape from the tower, and once that happens, they're sort of forced to face all of the political ramifications of their decisions. And this book is set in medieval Mongolia, I think, which was really cool to get that setting. And unfortunately, I didn't love this book as much as I was hoping to, especially considering I know a lot of people consider this their favorite Shannon Hale novel. So I'll talk about the things I liked. Shannon Hale has this really great writing style that really draws you through the story very easily. And I'm not saying it's overly simple. Shannon Hale is also great at world building. I definitely got a sense of the land and the culture and the mythology of this world, and it felt very real to me, so that was another plus. Unfortunately, there weren't a lot of other things I enjoyed. I thought the main character was just kind of okay, and the lady, the princess character, was also not very well developed, I thought. And we do find out later that there is a reason for the lady acting very strangely and being really traumatized by past events. We eventually do find that out, but it sort of felt like it was too late. I just didn't feel this, you know? And actually part of the reason might be I am extremely claustrophobic, So I think the reason I didn't enjoy the beginning of the novel was the fact that it felt too real, like being locked in a tower with no sight of the sky and everything. It was very atmospheric and very well done. But I did still have those other problems I mentioned as the book went on, so I don't think it was completely due to that. So with all those ups and downs, I ended up giving this book 3 stars. The next book I finished was my February Rereadathon pick, and the challenge was to reread your favorite book assigned in middle school, high school, or college. And I decided to reread Much Ado About Nothing by William Shakespeare, which is my favorite Shakespeare play that was assigned in either high school or college for the first time. I feel like this is really one of Shakespeare's best works because it's got the humor and wit that he excels at, but it's also got some really strong characters that you really feel connected to. Like, Beatrice is one of my favorite heroines of all time, and her relationship with Benedict, their back and forth is just like, it's so great. Like, if you enjoy hate to love or sort of like opposites attract type of romances, this is like the OG one. You've gotta check this play out. I mean, that part at the beginning where they see each other for the first time after years and their conversation is just so great because Benedict comes up to her and goes, "What, my dear Lady Disdain, are you yet living?" Beatrice goes, "Is it possible Disdain should die when she hath such meat food to feed it as Signor Benedict?" And it's just like, from the moment they talk to each other, I am sold. And I love this book. I think that there's a lot of underlying darkness in this comedy too that gives it a lot more depth. Like that whole situation with Hero and Claudio and that whole subplot is just really horrifying, and I feel like it's a really interesting examination of how easy it was to ruin a woman's reputation based on nothing. And I just highly recommend this play. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, obviously. Quick note about the edition I read. This one had a lot more textual notes and footnotes than the editions I usually read do, and I think those could be really helpful if somebody was reading this who's not used to reading Shakespeare. But I do read a lot of Shakespeare, so it sort of felt like there was too much background given. Like, they were defining words that weren't that necessary to define, and it kind of slowed down the reading experience for me. So maybe I would recommend this for like first-time readers. The only thing is there were a couple of places where they sort of spoil later events of the play, and I feel like even though this play is 400 years old, it's not quite well known enough to me to justify talking about the ending at the beginning, if that makes sense. But still really enjoyed this, and it's a beautiful edition. The next book I finished was Handbook for Dragonslayers by Mary Haskell, and this was a buddy read with Giselle Bradley, whom I will link down below. This is a fantasy story about a princess named Tilda. She's got a lot of princess duties that she doesn't enjoy doing because all she really wants to do is become a scribe and to write a great work. Another thing that she is dealing with is the fact that she was born with a club foot, and in this time period and in this area of the world, that was considered to be like bad luck, and she's treated badly because of this. Her cousin makes a grab for her lands, and she has to sort of decide if she even wants to come back to these people in the first place. So she ends up going on a kind of a quest with one of her best friends and her handmaiden, and they end up looking for dragons and finding magic, and all kinds of crazy things happen along the way. The premise of the book itself was really interesting, and I absolutely loved the characterization of Tilda. She feels very believable in the way that she doesn't always trust that she knows what's best. Mary Haskell did a great job of showing Tilda's disability in a way that made it clear that this does affect her life and how she thinks of herself and like interacts with the world around her, but it never became like a gimmick or the defining feature of her character. There was so much more to her than that. My favorite things about this book was the magic and mythology and the way that the author really wove that into tidbits from history. This isn't like a historical fiction novel or anything, but you can definitely pick up on clues or on places that she based certain things off of, and that was really fun. I gave this book 4.5 stars. I didn't love it quite as much as Mary Haskell's other 2 books that I've read, but it's still a fantastic novel. Last book I read for Cosyathon was the original version of The Beauty and the Beast by Gabrielle Suzanne Barbeau de Villeneuve. I'm sure I butchered that. This was really interesting. This was a very strange book because Beauty and the Beast is one of those stories that is adapted so frequently that I kind of assumed I knew how the original went. And that's not quite true. Half of this book consisted of one character explaining everything that had happened, like the backstory of this book, to all of the other characters. And that happened like 2 or 3 times. One person would stand up and say like, "Would you like to know where I came from and why this happened?" And Beauty, the main character, is like, yes, please tell me. And he's like, great. He talks for like 35 pages about all of his backstory. Then he would sit down and somebody else would stand up and be like, but wait, there's more! And then they would talk for 35 pages about this other backstory that had happened like 100 years ago. And it was just really oddly put together, I think. So the characterization is not nearly as important as the moral of the story. So the characters felt pretty flat. Beauty, our main character, doesn't even get a real name. She's literally just Beauty, because that's pretty much what she represents. And I think that this translation feels like it's a really good one. Of course, I don't speak French. I have not read the original French fairy tale, but it feels very suited to the story. What was kind of interesting is I read a couple of years ago that the original version of the story was actually written specifically as a tale to tell young girls so that they wouldn't be afraid of arranged marriages with older men they'd never met. And as creepy as that is, after reading this book, that kind of makes sense to me as a motivation for writing the story, because it definitely feels like something you would use to convince girls that it's okay, just marry who your dad tells you to and he'll turn out to be a handsome prince. Everything will be fine. I ended up giving this book 3 stars. So those are all of the books I read during the first half of February for Cozyathon and Rereadathon and just some other books that I mixed in there. And I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!